My name is Daniela and I'm a junior professor at the Global and European Studies Institute, and I'm a co-convener together with Julia of this panel. And the idea was to do a panel where the social question and the ecological question come together. And as you might know from in the social sciences, the social question is the question that, if we industrialize, and that means that we produce more with less, why is there still poverty and human suffering and so on? So this is a long-standing question in sociology. And then there's a related ecological question that you can ask about industrialization, that if industrialization also means that society has found ways to really manipulate nature in sophisticated ways and use it, why is it subject to more intense environmental disasters? And conventionally, this kind of linking of those questions is resolved in a way that they just reinforce each other. So labor conflicts become stronger. You have to exploit nature more, so there's more to distribute. But what we would like to do in this panel is to think about it a little bit differently and ask whether at the intersection of those two questions there could also be hope and imagination and an opening up of imagining new ways to live together. Nora Räthzel is a sociologist and professor emeritus at Umeå-Universität in Sweden. And she has written extensively on migration, racism, and over the last, I would say, 15 years or 20 years, also more on the relationship between labor and environmental struggles in a global context. Julia Kaiser is a PhD student at the Global and European Studies Institute, and she works on a particular type of labor struggle where workers take over the factory to convert it towards a more sustainable, environmentally friendly production. And she has recently become interested in the concept of hope, which is also a reason why this panel has hope in the title. Jakob Blumenfeld is a philosopher and postdoc at the Center for Social Critique at Humboldt-Universität Berlin, and he's currently co-directing a project on the socialization of land and energy. He has also published already 3 books, I think, widely on the concept of property. And there's one particular article that also inspired us to this panel, which is called Managing Decline, and you can find it online. Let's start with our first speaker, Nora Räthzel.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm just presenting also, at my age, it seems funny, but it's work in progress. So, but you will soon hear why. So I have been working on the relationship between labor and the ecological crisis for, as you said, about 15, 17 years. Recently, we finished a research project on the way in which workers at the shop floor level can analyze their workplace, the ecological impact of their workplace, and develop alternatives. Because our idea is that while the trade unions now are doing a lot of jobs with just transition and programs, the problem with this is that the workers on the shop floor are not normally included into developing this just transition program. So what we wanted to know is what do they think? How do they develop their ideas about a just transition? And we did this in a way by offering workshops for trade unionists on shop floor level. And the title of the workshop was How to Analyze the Ecological Impact of Your Workplace and Develop Alternatives, right? And we did 6 workshops, 3 in Spain, 3 in the UK, and all in all, about 80 people took part in those workshops. And each workshop lasted between 4 and 6 days. So just as an introduction. So there is a lot of work that trade unions are doing on just transition. Normally I start with that in the PowerPoint, but because we don't have so much time, I'm just looking at specific strategies that I find inspiring and new, and I'm going to read that so we're all on the same page. This is aviation workers in the UK, and they say aviation is heading for a crash landing. the projected growth of aviation is incompatible with safe levels of global warming. This needs to change, which means we'll need to change how we fly. And they say we need to fly less. Actually, they don't fly anymore, which is very funny for aviation workers. And but we also need to develop an independent worker-led vision of the future for aviation, that is developing those policies from below. And then we have one of the aviation workers here who went to Italy to look at the workers of the former GKN factory about which Julia is going to speak, so I'm not going to say much more about them. But what is very interesting, that there is this connection between trade unionists who are developing a different kind, a more radical kind of just transition in different countries. And what is missing? So one thing is what is missing has been developed actually by those workers that Julia is going to speak about, namely have a broader picture of what working life is. It's not just working, it's also living, it's also developing your capabilities, enjoying culture, and so all that is also part of a worker's life. So therefore, the point of departure for our workshop was also we need to ask broader questions. Not only how do people want to work, but how do people want to work and live. So this is also from the GKN workers. Abbiamo fame di un mondo nuovo. We have hunger for another world altogether, right? So why is this so important? It is important not only because it is necessary to include shop floor workers into the work of transforming the way in which we produce, but also because the way in which the just transition is developing at the moment, which is all about only reducing CO2 emissions, is a way that can actually destroy the environment more than it is already destroyed by the fossil fuel industry. So normally I have some slides here that give some examples of that, but I gave those slides this morning, so they're not here. So I'm going to speak about that without images. And the example I give, I mean, the general point is that the renewables and the electric cars and all these things, the renewables are not really renewables because they need machines in order to harness the energy from the sun and from the wind. And those machines need a lot of minerals and other materials. And some of them are very dangerous, but all of them are damaging the earth through mining. And the more renewables and the more electric cars we have, the more mining we will have. And mining means destroying biodiversity through deforestation, damaging the ecological balance that exists in the area, contaminating water, taking water away from mostly indigenous populations who need this water to survive, etc., etc. So what I'm arguing is, and I say that here, that the way we're doing the just transition is just shifting the destruction from the output of the production process to the input of the production process. And I have just one example. One example is a silver mine. I'm just going to tell it because you cannot see it, but that's my fault. It's the second biggest mine in Mexico, Peñaquito, and it has 103 square kilometers. That's the size of the Isle of, wie heißt diese Insel nochmal? Die Insel, wo die höheren Leute da immer hingehen, Sylt. is the size of the Isle of Sylt, and it's destroying the whole ecosystem there. And it's also very bad for the workers because they inhale all the dust that comes out from mining, and also the communities around the mine, etc. So this one mine, if we would just shift the energy that we use now in the world to renewables, we would need 100 more of these mines. And that's only silver. You know, it's just one of the minerals. That's not to say that I'm against renewables, because I recently read something that the AfD published, and they said the renewables are not really renewables. I say, oh my God, you know, I cannot be in that camp. So, but they're right. The renewables are not really renewable. But the question is not to use them, but the question is, how do we want to produce? How much do we need to produce? What do we need to have? What kind of materials and how much energy do we need? So in other words, we're going to have to shift down the way in which we live, especially in the global north, in order to be able to work not only against the fossil fuel industry, but also against the new forms of mining that are as destructive, okay? So that was... and some people in the degrowth movement, which I'm kind of part of, say the change of individual value and behavior should be the main target in degrowth. But I'm more on the side of Marx, who said, we do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. Here is the truth, kneel down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of the world's own dreams. And therefore, we need to listen. And that's what we try to do, listen to the workers. And the first method that we used in our course was that we asked them to sit in small groups and together draw an image of the world they want to live in. And the extraordinary thing about that was that the workers came from all kinds of sectors, from steel to nuclear to universities, anything you can imagine, care work, administration, and from different parts of the countries. But they all drew the same images, more or less the same images, and I will show you. So this is the course in Glasgow, and these are the different courses in the different cities in Spain and in the UK. And this is one of the images that these two people are creating together. And this is what
on this
they
idea
say.
of individualism. So this is everyone in their respective silos, where you go into the silo of the people, with the same people who think the thing as you do, then you shut the door and you just fight off against each other in this space. But what we really need is for the door to be open and for people to be willing to come together and take part in dialogues. So this here we would think of more, we would like to see more democracy, half strong democracy, half in sort of like local and regional levels, things like citizens' assemblies, the people themselves participating in budget decisions, local authority planning. This here, I don't know how well everyone can see it, but it's a drawing of the world, and the first pictures, ours and some other people's, had money at the top. So what we've done here is we've put currency symbols at the side, and we've put arrows to show that the money should flow equally around the world, as opposed to being the thing that we prioritise. And instead we prioritise people and planet. And then all these different things here represent different ways in which we can communicate with each other and the structures that would give rise to this. So that was one of the things that you asked us to look at. So we said that what would be good would be the different colours of stick people represent all the different people in the world. And what's happening here is the love hearts represent more harmony and more respect between people. And the dialogue represents just that, dialogue. But Hugh said, which is crucial, it's still okay to have conflict. Like, we're not just being like, let's just all hold hands and go around the world and sing Kumbaya and plant some trees and it'll all be grand. Like, it's fine to have conflict and disagreement, but we don't do it like this. when we're in the silo with the door shut. We have conflict and disagreement, but it ends up harmonious, and somewhere we're moving towards a better goal.
We were kind of thinking about that thing you were saying about maybe not working so much. So we were put more of the emphasis on this picture. So this is like, you know, if you were working, no matter what you're doing, whether you work in a factory or you work with a computer. And this idea of money coming first, and the idea of kind of infinite growth. Things have always got to be bigger and better. So if you kind of thought less about that, then you'd have more time to focus on, well, it's a house that it's your own individual house. It's like what you do in your spare time, things that you like to do. So if we didn't have so much of this, we could maybe have a bit more of this. People could have a wee bit more time to sort of breathe easy and think about what they want and get together and maybe make bigger changes because they've got more time where they're not having to work, to think about things and socialise and pursue their hobbies and have a more holistic life. But you need to get rid of these things first to get this.
And these are just to show you the variety of the images. So one is from the UK and the other is from Spain. And I don't have time to describe all the details, but the interesting thing is that people want to live locally, they want to work less, they want to be closer to each other, care for each other, they want to have some ownership about the workplace, or what they do, and they don't want to have nature outside. So you see here, you have agriculture is in the middle of the town, right? And so what we have seen in those images is people want to live a more sized down life when you ask them. You don't have to ask them about what kind of job do you want to have, because they just want to work less for money and do more exchange, more collective work, more cooperative work, live more locally, but also have relations to the global, as you saw or maybe read or maybe heard in the first two images. So that was very astonishing. And we were thinking about what kind of utopia is that? We then asked people to write just one sentence, what they want to do as a strategy in order to get there. And this is one example, to begin a process to develop true cooperative and sharing economy in order to confront the challenge of socially useful work, equitable exchange, and community wealth building. So everything you can imagine what one would like to have in one sentence. And I have to say that was the first method of the course. That was before we said one single word to them about anything, you know. Of course, one has to take into account that the people who came to these courses, they came voluntarily. So they were interested, they were already engaged in environmental issues, right? It's not like a sample about all kinds of workers. But what I think we learned from that so far is that if 80 people in different parts of countries and in different sectors more or less develop the same idea of the society they want to live in, it's worth looking into that more in detail. And it's worth to ask the trade unions whether it would not be important for them to ask this broader question: how do workers want to live and work, and not only am I going to keep my job and what will be my next job, which is important, of course, because in capitalism, if you don't earn your money in work, I mean, you're not going to survive. Although we have this fantastic Bürgergeld, of course. This is ironic. So that's the idea, the point of departure, to think about the perspective of workers and how they want to live in a more comprehensive way, and not only think about work and income. So I went to Ernst Bloch in order to think through about what kind of utopia, and is that not very utopian? And what he is writing is that utopias are not utopian in the sense that they are impossible, because the reality is always in process. Nothing is ever finished. We're never at the end of things, but things are always changing and are incomplete. And since that is the reality, there's also always the possibility to change them in a direction that we want to see. And he says one very interesting sentence in all that stuck in my head. And he said, utopias is also a manifestation of the things of the past that we wanted to have but were never realized, right? And when I was reading that, I thought maybe that's a problem that left parties, left organizations, left activists at the moment have, at least in Germany and also in Spain, where I live, also in Sweden anyway, that is that we have a kind of piecemeal of demands. We want this, we want that, but we don't have a vision of another world that is also rooted in the dreams and struggles that people had for another world, but they couldn't realize them, and they still exist as a dream and as a possibility. And when I was thinking about that, I looked at the program of the AfD because I wanted to understand what does that have to do with this. And there is a connection, which is that what the AfD does is really creating another vision of a world, but a vision looking backwards, but looking backwards to an idea where everything was in order, everything was fantastic, and we're just going back to that. So I was counting the words in their program, and one of the words that appeared most was zurück, back. Let's go back. And the most, apart from German and Germanist, the most often existing word was no, nicht, not. So it was this kind of, we live in a dystopia, and we need to go back to a utopian thing, but that already has happened, just back to the glorious past. Of course, we know there was never a glorious past. So maybe a good way, and I'm ending now, and is to fight the right is to think in more broader ways about the way we want to live and to connect to the dreams and the struggles that people have and still have in their mind about a world that is more about cooperation, collectivity, locality, connecting with nature, and connecting the demands to a broader vision about that in order to also say to people, yes, we need another world, that's right, but a world that is more democratic, more self-organized, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting start. And I will talk now about that GKN case in Italy a bit more in detail. Ernst Bloch wrote in the introduction to The Principle of Hope about the task of science. I quote, "Its concern, which must be pursued with all its strength, remains the truly hopeful in the subject, the truly hopeable in the object. The function and content of this central thing for us must be explored." I take this claim as the starting point for this presentation, along with a concrete case study. The focus is on the subjective side on a social movement for an ecological conversion of a factory, as Nora said, and on the objective side, a region in Italy that is undergoing industrial transformation, the Tuscany. In particular, the automotive industry is experiencing a drastic decline in production here. So what triggered that social movement? 4 years ago, 400 workers of an automotive supplier in Florence called GKN Driveline, a multinational company, were laid off. While usually planned closures are announced in advance, in this case, the workers were informed that they would not be coming back the following week. Aside from the aggressive approach taken by capital side, this scenario is currently visible in many regions in Europe. Factories, especially in the automotive industry, are being closed and production is being moved to Eastern Europe or other regions where wages are cheaper. In a context where workers, their families, and the regions are uncertain about what the future holds and the climate crisis escalates, public broadcasting often discusses the problem in the following way. I refer to a recent Deutschlandfunk contribution from last week, in which the jobs versus environment dilemma was discussed. The journalist describes her feelings when she hears about car manufacturers in crisis. Then she thinks, that's bad, because people are losing their jobs. And moreover, she thinks it's not even helping the planet if a car maker like Porsche can no longer afford a green transformation towards electric cars. We need to support the companies to make that change. The ecological voice responds, she also doesn't like job loss, but what's the use of talking about jobs when in a few years we won't be able to live on this planet? Jobs won't help us then. This is the jobs versus environment dilemma in the left liberal public. The automotive industry must transform, either toward electric mobility or towards downsizing. But job loss is a problem. The solution could be providing more financial support to companies to help them manage the shift to e-mobility, or to face the hard truth, accepting job loss in favor of the survival of our species and a post-growth society. The workers of GKN Florence, which I want to talk about, took a different path, and they brought workers as agents of green industrial transformation into the discourse and, above all, into reality. So what did they do after their layoff in 2021? Given the limited time, I summarize only very briefly. And I also, it starts now my presentation, so that's no problem. Okay, that's the factory I'm talking about. So what happened in the last 4 years? 2021, after the message of their layoffs, the workers go to the factory and start a permanent assembly. They organize protests where they scandalized the way of layoffs after the COVID pandemic in Italy. 30,000 people joined the workers in Florence on the streets for this one factory, which symbolizes many others. The layoffs were rejected by the court due to legal errors, but production remains on hold at the GKN factory. Together with scientists, ecological conversion plans for the factory are developed. They show technically parts for public buses could also be made here. And this is just 2 sentences from this conversion plan, where it's described how this process was started. So an interdisciplinary process was initiated by combining the desire of the workers to respond to the institutional vacuum and the desire to involve academic skills. On December 5th, 2021, a well-attended public meeting was held at the factory, attended by activists and researchers from all over Italy to discuss the analysis of preliminary proposal for the ecological productive conversion of the plant. So just wanted to show that in this moment the workers asked scientists to join their permanent assembly to think together about the future production. 2022, the workers present the proposal and demand a state intervention that would finance and lead this transformation. Roundtables led nowhere. 2023, a regional path is pursued. A grassroots referendum for a socially integrated ecological factory is organized by the workers and their allies. Tens of thousands vote in favor for a public sustainable factory. End 2024, a law is written by the workers and a legal team that allows the expropriation of the factory site and its provision, especially for economic activities that promote the mobility or energy transition. It is successfully voted on by the regional parliament. Moreover, a cooperative is founded by the workers. The hope of the movement is that the production of cargo bikes and photovoltaic systems, so new production ideas, because that production for buses was something they could only do with the help of the state. Now they decided to produce other things. This production could begin by July this year. The workers are now without wages, bridging this period through a worker aid association that reminds one of the early days of the workers' movement. Until they can resume production, they provide disaster relief for flooding, organize workers' literature festivals at the factory, or develop further their skills in bike and photovoltaic system production. An industrial real utopia in times of climate catastrophe. This real utopia has become a symbol of a worker-driven response to the jobs versus environment dilemma in the entire region and beyond. And I'm particularly interested in one central question. How did the initially few workers, really, I would argue 3 or 4, with a social and ecological vision manage to develop such a strong appeal and establish a laboratory of social ecological transformation of industry in the area near Florence? I believe, and maybe we could discuss those concepts, that some key concepts of Ernst Bloch's The Principle of Hope can explain how the idea of an ecological production alternative could gain such a strong attraction among the workers, but also among the whole region. In Bloch's thinking, the human ability to anticipate and shape the future is central. He emphasizes that people are capable of truly hoping, but it must be learned. He distinguishes active hope clearly from mere optimism or abstractly imagining the future. So active hope for him is based on the real conditions of the present, recognizes possibilities, and develops a roadmap. I think that Bloch sees emancipatory potential especially in 3 moments. First, in the expectation effects, including fear, anxiety, belief, and hope. These effects are future-oriented and can, especially in crisis situations, be the starting point for emancipatory action. Second, in the concept of warm stream, Wärmestrom, I don't know how to, if that's okay. Bloch distinguishes between cold and warm stream as 2 complementary stances that especially Marxism needs. The cold stream stands for analysis and critique of reality. The warm stream stands for enthusiasm, moral determination, solidarity, and visions of the future. Only when both work together, so analysis and hope, can true emancipation succeed. And third, in the theoretically informed awareness of possibilities, that's not a quote, it's like him writing about we need to think about concrete next steps and not about the future of the world or the utopia as such. Active hope requires for him an awareness of what is realistically possible but not realized and why. I would now, in the last part, like to outline in thesis form which role these 3 moments played in the 4-year political movement around the former GKN factory. So, number 1, factory closures are moments of condensed expectation effects. Unemployment, precarious conditions, and the loss of workplace community generate fear, anger, but also hope. The space of expectation that opens up in such moment was filled at GKN with this social-ecological future imagination. So how does Bloch define expectation effects? They are characterized by the fact that in them a real future appears, something that has not yet existed. Fear or hope break out within these moments, and Bloch identifies that hope often counters fear. I believe that in scenarios like factory closures, these expectation effects are clearly visible. Let me give you some examples. In recent years, numerous GKN plants have been closed. In 2020, the GKN plant in Kaiserslautern, 2021, the GKN plant in Birmingham, and by 2026, the plant in Zwickau is supposed to be closed, which is like 1 hour from here. How does fear and openness to the future manifest in those situations? What is evident in the use of is the use of symbols of death of the factory and the history of the factory. It is not only the workers' own fate that is scandalized, but the end of the factory histories with its significance for the entire region. What happens after the symbolic death of the factory remains open. At the same time, hope becomes visible in the strikes. For the future of the factory, a future for the children, a higher severance pay. I would conclude that social ecological future imaginations must also engage with the effective spaces of fear of the future, as well as the daydreams counteracting it in those scenarios. This was the case with GKN. The space of expectations that opened up after the announcement of the closure was filled by a few workers in a very short time. The fear of job loss was answered with a hope for a sustainable future for the region. Okay, so the next question is, why did this idea also unfold such a strong attraction outside the GKN workers? My thesis number 2 is the real utopia of the socially integrated factory, how they call it, acts as a warm stream, which collectivizes future dreams of various regional actors and brings them together into a new emotional community. It becomes clear a real utopia at times of climate crisis is not characterized by the good life or buen vivir, but by ideas of sustainable production, disaster relief, and wage losses. The workers transformed the original emotional community of the workforce into a broad regional community. In particular, climate activists, with their hopes for a more sustainable world, connected with the workers in that factory and around the factory, which were mostly hopes for better working conditions. The warm stream can be felt in this factory since 4 years. I'll give you some examples. For 4 years now, the workers have continued to organize themselves in a 3-shift system. This serves 2 purposes. On the one hand, they guard the factory. On the other, they escape the loneliness of unemployment or new jobs lacking a sense of workplace community. Cultural events have become central in this community. They fill the time until the cooperative can begin production, but also continue beyond that point. One particularly notable event is the annual Working Class Literature Festival. Its themes clearly express the aim of continuing the history of workers' movement. The first year focused on the genealogy of workers' literature, the second on the present, and the third on the future. Each year, on the anniversary of the mass dismissal, July 9th, a large festival is held. It commemorates the end of the old factory and celebrates the beginning of the socially integrated factory. Some workers have collaborated with theater producers to create a stage play based on their story. Others are completing training in bicycle manufacturing. The factory collective is increasingly traveling to surrounding villages to provide disaster relief during floods. In Bloch's word, they aim to realize a classic utopia, actually. It revolves around, I quote, the questions of a life of fulfilling, exploitation-free work, but also about the life beyond work. So this is how Bloch shows in the whole history of humanity the central topics of utopias. Of course, in our world, the real utopia comes along with a lot of problems. For example, for the family systems, which before were based on one income at least, which was relatively high. I can tell you a bit more in the discussion if you want about the problems in between the family systems in that case. So then my last thesis, number 3. To move from wishful thinking to active hope, one needs in awareness of possibilities. This competency is held especially by one of the workers who takes on the role of an organic intellectual. So it's important to know that even before the closure, there existed a well-organized factory collective of the workers. However, as with all social movements, there are individuals who act as leaders through their proposals. Thought in Bloch's terms, emancipation requires both a critical analysis of the given circumstances and an analysis of possibilities. Especially one of the workers, Dario Salvetti, masters this competency. He writes about the history of Workers' Council and the workers' movement today. While many other colleagues were skeptical of the climate movement, he brought them into the factory. While others wanted to give up, he initiated alliances with scientists. He made contact with Argentinian cooperatives to learn from their successes and failures. What is visible here is not only charisma, but the ability to make the not yet visible and actionable in the present. The most recent literature festival took place just a few weeks ago, and a trade unionist responsible for several surrounding workplaces spoke on the closing panel and shared her future vision. I quote, "When we look around from this stage," she was sitting on, "we can see how the socially integrated factory has already become a gathering point for these struggles over the years. But it can be more than that. It can be a place where these workers who come from different sectors and different countries meet, organize, and come to recognize one another. A kind of union work that fights to change working conditions, but also tries to build something beyond that, a community that is reshaping itself. It remains to be see how this community, one that strives for the seemingly impossible, so industrial production, cross-milieu solidarity, and the desire for a different society, will evolve." Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that, Julia. I'm actually hopeful, maybe, which is a surprise, given my sentiment about the state of things in the world. But yeah, both of you really made me feel something. Okay, so my talk is called Managing Decline, on the subject of fossil capitalism and its demise. So managing decline is an industrial term. It's a term that business owners, capitalists, and management writers use to talk about ending production sites, ending production firms, and how to manage that in the business. I'm using it in a different sense in terms of how do you manage the decline of the fossil world that we're living in, right? How do you manage it in a way that's not harmful, lethal, or toxic, or destructive, that doesn't have the same effects as deindustrialization does in the West, or as the fall of the Soviet Union did? How do you have a planned transition, in a sense? And one thing that I will talk about today is not just how do you manage the decline of an industry, but also of those subjects who develop their sense of self based on all these fossil fuel inputs throughout their lives, whose sense of values have been determined by carbon-based products, carbon-based lifestyles, in which it's very hard to just switch out without causing reactions, aggressive reactions based on resentment towards challenging one's way of life, which can come out in very destructive ways. So one of the tasks for me is to help you and help ourselves visualize the problem. I'm going to start with a quote from Günther Anders, who is my guiding spirit through the talk and through my life. He is a husband of Hannah Arendt. He wrote about the nuclear bomb and studied with Heidegger. He's a very interesting thinker. Lived in Vienna for 50 years, exiled in the States. He wrote this. This is a passage from a text he wrote called Theses of the Atomic Age in 1956, I think, from FU. It says, "The basic dilemma of our age is that we are smaller than ourselves, incapable of mentally realizing the realities which we ourselves have produced. Therefore, we might call ourselves inverted utopians. While ordinary utopians are unable to actually produce what they are able to visualize, we are unable to visualize what we are actually producing. What Anders meant by this is that it's hard for us to actually realize the consequences of our productive capacities. Both the technical scope of our production, on the one hand, no individual can really grasp. It's distributed across society, so no one really knows the extent of the productive capacities that we are creating, and therefore also the destructive capacities. He was talking about the nuclear bomb. But also morally, it's hard for us to visualize the moral consequences of what we do, what we produce. Right? It's hard to visualize it. We're beyond our imagination in Anders' sense. So the task of the present is to help our imagination extend to catch up to our actual production. Our aesthetic imagination, so we can actually visualize what we're doing, and our moral imagination, so that we could create new concepts to be responsible for things that usually we didn't have to be responsible for, like the effect of carbon dioxide on individuals in the future or far away from me based on my actions today. You know, there's no moral categories that can solve that puzzle based on our past moral conceptions of harm. So that's what I'm hoping we can do in this talk. Now, what do I want to visualize? Well, I want to visualize is that our civilization, as you all know, is carbon-based. Not just carbon-based in the scientific term that we're carbon-based life forms, but I mean hydrocarbon-based. Right? The products that we live by are produced and release a lot of carbon in their production. The materials that we use in our daily lives are based on many petroleum-based products. Our energy systems are highly mediated by fossil fuels. Just to name some other basic products of this civilization, not only energy and transportation, but also plastics, synthetic materials, cosmetics, personal care products, pharmaceuticals, household cleaning products, electronics and appliances, medical equipment, agriculture, fertilizers, construction materials, packaging, and food storage utilize many petrochemicals and take fossil fuels as their inputs. Also, food products, food packaging, beauty products, diapers, drugs, sunglasses, crayons, everything that you use to work, move, heat yourselves, eat, at some stage in kind of the circuit, probably went through some fossil-based system, right? So it's a kind of civilizational structure that affects us, right? Affects who we are and how we think about ourselves. It's not as simple as to just kind of switch it out with something renewable that's not even renewable. Right? It takes work. It takes work, not just work on the world, but work on ourselves to be able to deal with how we will move, how we will heat ourselves, how we eat in new ways. Now, this carbon civilization, like I've said, it produces fossil subjects in this account, right? This is us, right? Both the workers who work in fossil-based industries, but also the subjects and consumers who eat, who transport, who use all sorts of products. I made some little icons here for you to visualize it. Who've taken this kind of material foundation, the materialist infrastructure of our lives, affects our subjective self-awareness, particularly kind of the concept of freedom. Right? How we conceive ourselves as free beings, able to move freely, able to freely dispose of products, to use them at our will, to travel, freedom to dominate, freedom to exploit, freedom to extract, right? All these freedoms are based on fossil fuels inputs. Security, being secure in your home, warmth, all kinds of self-conceptions. You know, if we want to be materialists, they have materials. They have kind of, they're not determined by these products, right? But they condition them, right? So it can be changed, right? We're historical beings; anything can be changed, but they are conditioned, right? And therefore, it takes work to change these conditions. They can't just be wished away, like in this abstract conception of hoping, or in this quote that you mentioned about focusing on just the wishes and desires. Now, against this fossil subjectivity and this carbon civilization, there are proposals, many proposals in the last decades, right? The most popular, phrase in German is like the social-ecological transformation. You hear it all the time. It's kind of the name of a million projects and grants and conferences and papers. And there's also energy transition, eco-emancipatory project that Blue Dorn uses, the Green New Deal in the States, degrowth, decarbonization, or even decolonization are seen as banners in which this transformation against fossil capitalism can occur, right? Huge projects of really transforming this civilization are taken up, and they run into blockages, right? Oh, I don't have my my transitions here. So, that's right there. Oh, interesting. Okay, so you see the arrows. So they run into blockages. These massive projects are wished up, right? And who bears it, right? The fossil subjects, we bear it. And sometimes we can't live up to it. There's not just of course there are the objective interests that block it, right? The fossil companies that have trillions of dollars in assets in the ground, they're not going to give it up easily. But it could be changed with laws. It could be changed with pressure. It could be changed with politics. But there's also the fossil subjects who resist transformation as well. So these projects encounter failure, right? This failure is interpreted as a defeat of these projects, of these transitions, of these transformations, right? Of those Paris Accords, of these deadlines to transform the world. They're encountered as defeats. It leads to a kind of exhaustion, both a subjective exhaustion and an objective exhaustion of the politics, and ends up in kind of resignation, right? That is the incapacity to do things. What happens to hope in this paradigm? Well, hope turns into, what happens to optimism in this paradigm? Right? You start with hope and optimism, maybe a kind of superficial hope. I'm not going to say it's like what you were talking about, but a kind of basic hope that things can be changed, that we could take on this project, that we can do it. It hits failure after failure after failure. Hope turns into despair, right? Nothing can change. Optimism turns into pessimism, right? We're doomed. We are doomed. I'm going to suggest that pessimism and despair are not the end of the story. Actually, pessimism and despair can be motivating, right? They can be helpful if done correctly. Not all kinds of pessimism, not all kinds of despair. Just like not all kinds of hope are helpful, not all kinds of optimisms. So I think one of the reasons for this resignation and this exhaustion is that there's an excessive optimism with many of these demands. The optimism is too high, right? This puts too much burden on the hope, right? This hope can then be easily defeated, right? There's an excessive optimism, an overburdened hope that, on the shoulders of just a couple activists, that they can really change the world, as if it's only up to them, right? They take on these claims for all of us. And when it doesn't happen, it leads to disappointment, right? And that disappointment can be harmful. What does Gunther Anders say about hope? Well, let me read it to you. He's very harsh. I think hope is just another word for cowardice. What is hope, really? Is it the belief that things will get better, or the will that they will become better? No one has ever produced an analysis of the act of hoping, not even Bloch. Hope should not be created, it should be prevented. For no one will act out of hope. Every hopeful person abandons the improvement to another instance. Yes, the weather is getting better, maybe I can hope. The time does not get better like this, nor does it get worse. But in a situation where only individual action counts, hope is only another word for giving up personal action. So Anders here is criticizing this conception of hope, that things will get better on their own, right? That you just have to hope in the future and things will change. Kind of this progressivist idea of hope, right? That things will just change. And he's really against that, right? You can't just hope for things to happen. You have to do things, right? In the GKN, they changed reality, right? They didn't just hope for it. They changed it. Anders says, we must have the courage to stop hoping. Bold statement. I don't know if we could live up to it. Now, where Let's go. Now, against overburdened optimism and excessive hope, I think we could have a kind of active despair, right? When things fail, when you think nothing's possible, that can also be motivating to keep acting, not because you think it'll be successful, but because it's the right thing to do, right? That's kind of a moral claim to change and to act that's not dependent on if it fails or not. There can be an engaged pessimism, right? Pessimism in the sense that the reality is pessimistic, right? The reality itself feels against you, feels like it's getting worse, or maybe it is getting worse. But that does not have to have an effect on the desire to act, right? As long as there's uncertainty towards the future, then action is always possible, like resistance is always possible. There's a kind of fatalist pessimism that I'm against, that Anders, I think, is against as well. But a non-fatalist pessimism, one that understands the worst, that it is getting worse, right? And that can motivate you to do even, stronger actions. Okay, so given this background, now I'll get to managing decline. Right, now that we have the subjective buffers to shield us, what would it mean to manage the decline of a carbon civilization? Now, I call it here a planned obsolescence of carbon civilization. Right? Planned obsolescence is this industrial term in which companies make products that they know will expire so that you will have to buy new ones. I think we need to plan the obsolescence of carbon civilization. Right? It has to be planned. It has to be accounted for. It has to be taken care of. It can't just be hoped for. I'm going to read you a quote from Holly Jean Buck, who talks about developing a capacity to plan the ending of things. In her 2021 book, Ending Fossil Fuels, she writes, "There are all kinds of things to move away from, things we must stop doing because they are killing us, things we must retreat from because they are doomed as a part of adaptation, and technologies that are foisted upon us, which we can choose to reject. Policy-wise, these are all in completely different topical boxes, but culturally they are related to a basic capacity to end things. This is a capacity related to political power, but it's also a psychological capacity, and it's about planning. Ending things in a planned fashion is a capacity that we need to develop in order to thrive. Manage decline, manage retreat, manage rejection. These things aren't negative, they're fundamentally affirmative. They're about taking control of our own destiny." Right? The capacity to end things is not something we're really taught, right? We're taught that things should keep on growing, keep on moving, keep on developing. Nothing should end, right? Death isn't evil. We should extend life infinitely, virtually, right? But we're finite creatures, right? And our social system is also finite. So planning how to end things is a capacity that can be trained and developed, right? Culturally, psychologically. And that requires space for grief, for mourning, for knowing how to plan the end of a life as well. The amount of things that need to be ended is mounting. Not only do we need to end things that are harmful, like fossil fuels or pesticides or plastic bags, we need to end things that are doomed. The latter demands a shared understanding of what's doomed. When it comes to climate change, there are parallels between managed decline and managed retreat. It won't just be moving away from coastlines or wildfire-prone areas. It will be moving from areas where aquifers are depleted, ski towns where it no longer snows. We need a wider cultural shift that will enable us to manage all of this change and all these various endings, not something that dismisses them as all okay, indicating that we should simply be resilient either, but something that allows for grief as part of the process, right? So this decline of our fossil-based world it will be, hard. And there should be space for grief and for mourning the kinds of lifestyles we've lived, right? For processing that, for filtering it, for managing in a way that can be creative, right? That can be productive, that can be social. That doesn't just lead to reactive formations that get expressed through resentment and aggression and violence. So that was the objective side, in a sense, managing decline objectively. What about the subjective side? Managing decline as a careful phase-out of fossil subjectivity, right? We need to phase out fossil fuels. but also the fossil subjectivity upon which those fossil fuels relies and which it created. Now, to think about what this means, I'm just going to use a quote from Horkheimer, talking about how progress in technologies, how progress in relationships, how progress in urbanization challenges our sense of self. So I think in the 60s, when he was writing, Horkheimer wrote this in one of his memoirs. The role of a changed environment, right? He's talking about the changing kind of forms of work and labor in society, from assembly line to computer, and the disintegrating, atomizing effect of the mass media are known. Because people constantly move within cities or from one city to another, they no longer have a permanent home, and change the differentiating effect on the individual. Altered relations mean that people no longer share experiences in a closely knit life, no longer age together or reciprocally constitute themselves through knowledge of each other. This is equally true of other relationships, friendships, and professional associations. Along with these material preconditions of the self, the human ones disappear as well. It's just kind of classic sociology of like an alienated self in an atomizing world, right? In the atomized social reality, the atom is split as it is in the physical world. Yet both dissolve something that had been mistakenly hypostasized. What is being destroyed through progress are mythical entities. It is justice that puts an end to them. So in his classical dialectical twist, Horkheimer here says, okay, so there's this atomizing possibilities. It's destroying our bourgeois subjectivities. It's destroying what, the character of who we took ourselves to be. But it's destroying something that is itself mythical, right? This idea that we are closed selves, right? Actually, we are broken up. We are fragments. We are socialized. So maybe it's a good thing sometimes to break up these mythical subjectivities that we think we are. And I think this is what needs to be thought of with this fossil, with managing decline of our fossil subjectivities, right? Is there a way to allow the subjectivities built upon fossil fuels to dissolve and see that as something kind of just, right? Now, how can this happen practically? Well, I'll just end with a couple or two kind of vague ideas. On the one hand, one thing I've been working on is the concept of socialization, right? So socialization means changing the property relations, changing the ownership relations of an industry, of a sector, of a good, bringing it into common use, a common plan. Like in the GKN, it's a kind of socialization of the factory. But you could also think of socialization of land, socialization of energy. I'm thinking, what would it mean to have a reparative socialization, right? We're living in this, instead of allowing for this downturn, this decline in a process that's similar to deindustrialization, which caused immense amount of suffering across cities around the world, is there a way to have a reparative socialization that can care for the land, that can care for ecosystems, for energy grids, for workplaces, right? But this is not just a romantic conception of kind of repairing our relationship to nature, but also technical infrastructure, right? How do you socialize our relationship to technical infrastructure that is reparative? And also socialize our relationships to each other as well, right? In the way Horkheimer meant. We are damaged by this society, right? So perhaps there needs to be space to repair and socialize the relations that have damaged us. This is a nice coal plant in an island off Japan that is, decommissioned. But there's many kinds of ruins in the world that could be repaired, right? Repaired in ways that can produce, sustainable or socially useful labor for communities. I would call this a kind of socialization, right? And I think that's one way through this process. On the other hand, like I said in the beginning, there has to be a kind of opening to new forms of aesthetic experience, right? New relationships to the natural world, right? That kind of allow us to relate to our ecosystems, to how we redistribute labor that reflects this process, right? That gives space to visualizing, right? These transformations, to new ways of working, right? That gives space to visualizing and aesthetically experiencing the loss that comes with climate change, right? That can imagine new kinds of technology or that can live with ruins, and that can aesthetically experience the cities as themselves, sustainable places, right? So that would call for a kind of expanded sense of aesthetic experience, aesthetic imagination, which will allow space to reflect and come to terms with this process, to work through it, right? Here's just one simple, not an example, but more kind of an inspiration from Agnes Denise in 1982. She planted a wheat field right by the World Trade Center when it still existed. She planted a wheat field with farmers to kind of show the relationship to the country, right in the center of finance, to overcome this distinction between the town and country, which Marx talked about in the manifesto. It's an aesthetic act which kind of reveals the negative space by just having wheat around. And in that sense, help us come to terms with what this process is for us, what it means. I conclude with a simple imperative, which is to stay with the negative, right? Allow the negative. My only conclusion is that sometimes it's good to let the negativity of the present moment sit with us, to ruminate, right? To reflect it, to visualize it, to let it motivate you to act, right? The positive can come later. It might sometimes require positive visions. We could talk about that. But that doesn't mean abandoning this negative spark. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start with a question that goes to all of you, because whether you could clarify the role of a concept of possibility in your talks, or feasibility. I think, Julia, you were the most explicit about how you use it, and then also how it links to imagination. Because at some point in Jacob's talk, I thought this kind of is this difference between the older normal utopians and the inverted utopia. Is this something that happens here on the panel, or is there something else going on? So, but there is a problem of the imagination in the sense of that. Nora and Julia, you're calling for the imagination of something that could happen and things that we don't realize that they could happen. And then Jacob, in your talk, it's more imagining what is already happening, and we don't even have the capacity to imagine it. So it's already So there's kind of a twist here, and I wondered whether you could all reflect on that. Maybe if you want to, of course.
Just on the question of utopia, my position on utopia is this. I think utopias are good to develop, utopian projects, utopian texts, utopian visions, but not because they're possible or feasible, but because they sometimes show us this gap between what we want and what we have, and that can be motivating. Or they could show us, or they could be a starting point for a conversation of what we don't like about this utopia, right? Oh, this maintains the family structure, or this maintains property, or I don't know. So I think utopias are helpful as ways of just starting that conversation about what you want, but not as blueprints of the future.
I see that slightly differently. But I was very intrigued by what you said about negativity. And I thought that the images that the workers, to just stay with that, made were also implicitly negating things. So they were not just, oh, this is all beautiful. So implicitly, and sometimes they said it, we don't want to work that much, they were also negating the existence in which they were. And so I think there is a good connection here between the need to negativity and the possibility of change. But I don't even know if the images that the people drew, if you can classify them as utopian, because they had a lot of realistic elements in them. They had a lot of things which they live already, but they don't live sufficiently and broadly enough and not self-determined. So I think it is kind of motivating to say these are the things that we don't want to have, but also the things that we cannot have anymore, as you said. I think that's very important to look at that. But it's also good to have some things where you think, okay, but I can have this and this and this instead if I really fight for it. Even if it is a struggle where I also like very much what you said. You keep on resisting, even under conditions where you think, well, it might not get anywhere, but that's what you do. Because otherwise, you will not be satisfied with yourself also, right?
I was really inspired by the text Jacob wrote about managing decline, also thinking about this GKN case, because for me it really, like a lot what happens there is about repair work, mutual aid, thinking about how this factory could be used in a different and sustainable way. And this is why it's very interesting to me to then think together about if it's about that relationship between hope and negativity, because to me, like what they, for example, do there, whenever they talk, demonstrate, whatever, it is about the negative situation they live in, but also possibilities for next steps, as I tried to explain, like what law could help us to expropriate the factory, what kind of aid could help the community next to us, which is already flooded. And I think to like stay with the negative as a counterpart to a lot of like left-wing or green politics, which says, let's talk about how it could be, and then start with the climate camp and see how far we come there. I absolutely agree. But I think if we think of class dynamics or social dynamics, I'm not sure how you would conceptualize your ideas in a for groups, because like I think it shows us a lot about subjects, like single persons a bit, and what happens to me or to you or to whoever. But if we think about, for example, workers who lose their jobs, or if we think about people who, I don't know, like the lifestyle they got, I think without the critics, but also some steps where you could, in crisis, which shape your agency, which always happens in society, because someone will always tell you, okay, here is Tesla, the new way of working, or here is, like, there are actors shaping the future, and without those rooms of possibilities or whatever, I'm not sure how it should work, because I think to only do it then again in this individual way of, okay, let's, like in this retreat way, okay, let's as a community sit together and accept decline or whatever. I think this is not really how it works, because everyone, always someone comes in and brings up new options. Yeah, this is just what I'm not sure about. So and without, for example, in that case, at GKN, if there wouldn't be someone who would say, okay, we could use this factory in another way, every worker would, I'm quite sure, now be without work or in another job without that community. So, it's just one situation. But
So many thanks for these thought-provoking presentations to all three speakers. So I will ask my questions to Nora, but others are also welcome to reply, to react, and comment. So my first question is, do really these workers you work with, do they really think in utopian terms, or it was, to say, your intellectual provocation, let us talk about the utopia, about a better future, or they just thinking in their everyday routine how to improve their life, not about remote future idealized society, and so on. And thank you so much for your point about AfD, that the key word in your understanding why they are so popular is back. So coming back to idealized past, which actually never existed, but they believe in. So it reminds me immediately Friedrich Engels and his article about current condition of English textile workers, where he made two images, how it was and how it is now, that in the past English tailors lived in their private houses in a countryside, and everyone worked in his personal workshop. And now, unfortunately, they left their houses and they moved to the big cities, to the big factories, and so they are no more owners of their workshops. They are selling their working force, so they are living in a horrible living conditions, and so on and so on. So this immediately this feeling of nostalgia about idealized past and these horrible conditions of industrial aftermath of industrial revolution. So, and some points at the end. So my conclusion, which preliminary conclusion, maybe mistakenly, I made from your presentations, that political elites have no vision of future. So all these old right and old left parties, they actually moved to the center. They promise nothing in the remote future. They just promise to make some improvements in the next 4 years. And the ordinary people are afraid of future. They have negative expectations because they are afraid to lose their job. They are afraid of all these talks about climate change, global warming, and so on and so on. And the ordinary people, they only have an image of idealized past their parents or grandparents lived in. So can you agree with it, or you have some other answers? Thank you.
First, thank you so much for this finally ending this boring, shallow, never-ending hope, progress, always better, right? And we are also tired of it. Huh? So it's nice to see, okay, yeah, life is something else, huh? Reality is something else. But are you then buying that actually there is this hope, progress, so on, which I really doubt. I think it is sold, but we actually do not live in the life which is, you know, nice, beautiful, progressive, positive, and so on. Rather, I would say human condition is just the other way around. We desperately need to get out, but we cannot. It's completely the opposite. Do we have a tension there, or am I missing something? That would be one. And the second one is ending, how did you call, we need to stop doing, no, stop, and to start ending things, to end. I'm not sure now what's that, huh? But my impression was, so this is the second question, my impression was that you are taking this ending process as some kind of non-action. And in my reading, this would be action par excellence, another kind of, but action nevertheless. So you can think with Hannah Arendt, with Activa, for example. In that sense, this is very importantly action with some other features, which entails hope because you want to preserve something. You want to preserve life in the end. So it's not pessimistic at all. Yeah, I thought it was just interesting to... Thank you.
I have also one question for Julia, one for Nora. For Julia, very short, because you played the ball. What is about the family systems that you wanted to share? To Nora, I'm also very curious about, let's say, the politics or ethics of method. I'm particularly curious how you approached also the trade unions as kind of research participants. Did you co-design also the workshops together with the trade unions, or you as a research team came up with it? Like, who did design it? How did you design it? How did you manage to get workers 4 to 6 days off for a workshop? Like, really practical question. I'm also very much amazed by this. And then finally, you also asked yourself, or you said you also approached the trade unions with the question, like, don't you want also to discuss how people not only work, but also want to live? So once you posed that question to the trade unions, what was the reaction? What came afterwards?
I was thinking about this word that I hate, resilience, and I think it can get inside this whole debate, so to say. And I wanted to ask you if you think about how sorry, I have lots of thoughts in my mind, but this, I don't know, Agamben talks about this potentiality that's always there behind the horizon, is omnipresent, and there's always like this kind of hope, and how in this way of embracing negativity are we always resilient, and always regarding what Katarina said, that what action can we take upon that if we are taught to be resilient, maybe in this kind of discourse, and where can we actually take the state of emergency not as an exception, but rather as a rule in the crisis that we're living in.
Depends how you define utopia. You know, some people define it as totally crazy thing, like we're going to live in Mars or something. Actually, I looked up images of utopia. They're all techno-utopias. They're actually, in the images about utopias, there are no people there at all. It's just buildings, and sometimes they're green utopias. Here you have buildings and a lot of green, but still in the green utopias, you have no people. And if you read a lot of the literature, it's about new technologies, super technologies, but the relations between people, power relations, gender relations are more or less the same. So then, it depends how you define utopias. In this case, I think I was a bit reluctant to define it as utopias because a lot of the things that the people wanted, they already experienced that as part of their life, but they were not able to realize it in the broader and more realistic way in which they wanted it. You know, you always care for your friends and your families and so on, but you don't have the time for it. You always want to live in nature, but it's not there. So I think I still called it utopias because even a just transition in the, let's say, ordinary way in which the trade unions are thinking out it is utopian in a capitalist society because they don't have the power to decide how to work and how work is going to change. So in that way, in that sense, it is, but it is a real utopia. So I like to use that word, a real utopia in the sense that there are a lot of elements in reality that have to be broadened and have to come to the forefront and have to become central. So the hope thing in the surprising images that the people painted or drew was that they already have this idea of a decarbonized world, the things that you were talking. Because in their pictures, there were, for instance, no cars. There was never a car in the pictures. And although we didn't say, we said, and that's also to how did we design it, we just said, draw the society you want to live in. We didn't say anything else, and we didn't have an introductory talk or something. So it was very surprising to see that they actually already wanted to live in a degrowth, decarbonized world. And then to the question, how did we design it? We designed it in the research project, and not together with the trade unions. The only thing that they did was we wrote a flyer and they sent it out to all the workers, and they helped us to find a hotel or something, a venue where we could do it. They didn't influence it in any way, and some of them took part, but we said we only want to have trade unionists who are shop floor workers, not official trade unionists. We didn't discuss this with trade unionists yet, these results, but I want to say, just as another positive thing, that, you know, the trade unions were not always so limited in their thinking as they are mostly now. Like, for instance, the IG Metall, 50 years ago, had a big conference which was called The Quality of Life. And they published like 20 brochures, and they were about environmental issues, 3 of them. So what I want to find out with this research, or what I want to bring into focus for the public debate, is that change is already there in the ideas and the wishes of people. So in that sense, you can actually connect to that. And the problem is that neither the trade unions nor the public policies connect to those kind of wishes and desires that people already have. So in that sense, it's not so utopian, but it's just listen, ask people other questions than just, do you want to have a job, or do you want to do solar panels instead? Which they don't like these questions, because they say, okay, and what if I don't want to do solar panels? Am I then fucked or what? That was one worker said, you know. You don't ask them how they want to live, and you will be surprised how many ideas people have already. And then you can connect to them and develop politics that are different from what is being done now.
On the question of, do we live in a world that's kind of based on hope and progress? I mean, it's like you mentioned, a lot of our conceptions of progress and hope are based on technological development. And that, you know, we tend to think that progress and technology are kind of the same thing. The more technology that we have, the more, you know, AI we have, the more progress we have, and, you know, the better things are getting, right? There's kind of also this conception of social progress, right? The more rights we have, the more equality we have. But I think there used to be this belief that progress was happening in the world, right? There used to be this belief that we can change things, that people we're getting a more equal society. But I think that belief is kind of broken a little bit in the last years, that actually a lot of progress on social rights can be rolled back, right? Like the talk from earlier today by Stina, or by others in your panel. Yeah, how things can be rolled back, how progress can be ended. I mean, from the perspective of those who are rolling back that progress, you know, they're stopping something harmful. But I would say, like, this idea that things, from the side of those who desire kind of emancipation from kind of this system, it seems like progress has taken a break. But then, given this situation, a lot of people then just hope that things will get better. You know, in USA, it's like, well, what I'm hearing a lot from people is just, you know, just wait for a couple of years, and things will change. Just hope. Just wait. Things will get better. They always do. So, and I think that's just no longer the case. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you have to deal with it. You have to take care of, maybe this is because there was an overburdened optimism, an overburdened hope that now is disappointed and then cannot act. That's kind of my claim in the beginning. I think ending things is a kind of action. It's not just non-action. I mean, it depends, like, you know, is a strike an action or a non-action? I think it's an action. It's an action where you don't do anything. But it takes a lot of work sometimes not to act. But when I talk about ending things, it means ending kinds of labor, kinds of activities, ending kinds of uses of things, but also replacing them with new ones, transforming them in different ways. Ending one thing but making another, and doing that in a way that can be social, right? That's not just on the burden of the individual, I think, at the end of the day, because the individual cannot bear this, right? So to make it a class project or a social project, I think, is a way of managing this decline, of repairing this relation. The word resilience is everywhere in this climate literature and in this urban planning. Resilience is everywhere. What does resilience mean, right? It means being strong when things happen to you, taking a hit and standing strong, right? It means adapting to hard conditions and bouncing back, not letting in the outside, right, affect you too much, right? Being strong. I think that can be very dangerous. Maybe we should let things hurt us. I mean, let ourselves feel the loss or pain or suffering or change, and that can be productive. Maybe we shouldn't adapt to everything, to every change. Like in the GKN, they're not adapting. They want to transform. They want to change. So I'm very skeptical of the resilience terminology, especially when it's used by those like elites or those in power, when they kind of offload it onto workers or individuals. Say, just be resilient. You're going to have less money, but it's okay. I don't know, but we need to get it done. I mean, I'm sure there's other ways of using the term, but yeah, for me, mostly, it's not the right kind of negative.
Yeah, I was very interested in your comment because also to me, that question came up whether you mean by ending just a stop or a process. And I come from industrial sociology and labor sociology, and it's always people thinking of, for example, the past of their factory at Zwickau. They talk about die Gelenkwelle, which was for years very important, or for since 50 years, their parents were working at that Gelenkwelle. Now it's supposed to go, and now people, I think if we would talk only about stopping things and say, okay, deal with it, that this now must stop, and there's nothing else, then I'm not sure how that transformation should work. So I liked how you explained it in the end, that also that kind of ending must be a process of transforming. And I think, therefore, at least from the studies I know, always the past is quite important, as we discussed it on the last panel, that people are thinking about that work once was better, or that the labor movement once was strong, or that whatever, and now the situation is quite negative. So also there because I come from that class analysis perspective, I wouldn't quite agree that at the moment everywhere everyone is quite hopeful, because I think that's a quite one part of society, which is maybe more, I don't know who you refer to, but the people I know or the movements I know who are hopeful are more coming from maybe that middle class way of life. And when you talk to people from, any, I don't know, precarious workers from industries which are declining, from DHL, from wherever, people are quite are suffering. And I think whenever I at least saw action, then it's because there is anything where you say, okay, at the moment we are looking forward to any kind of horizon which could be a bit better. So I think there's still, I'm still interested how we could call it that way of keeping critical. And I would still say I completely agree in regarding the climate catastrophe we are facing. It's not about saying there is hope. I'm not sure how good it will look in 10 or 20 years. I think it looks quite badly. But still, there must be, I think, some way of saying, okay, there's hope for our community to deal with it, at least. But yeah, I'm very interesting. And the question with the family relations, this is also why I think only ending things, talking about that is quite difficult, because in that case, for example, at the beginning, the women, mostly women, directly formed also a collective which says, okay, we are the women of the workers and we support them because also we are workers. So that way of saying we have a class movement which interacts, even if we are not all male industrial workers, we are in this together. That worked quite well. And now 4 years afterwards, one of the workers told me some weeks ago, all of the 300 workers who are not here anymore, it's mostly because of struggles in the family, of course, because the women, mostly women, say, what kind of utopia and what kind of repair work, festival work, whatever are you doing here? We live together and you brought quite a lot of money home. So they, of course, somehow need to discuss that relationships. And also, therefore, I think it's important to have always a view on the concrete situations, because only talking about change for everyone, which somehow must happen when we don't look at the situation in which it happens, then I don't know how that kind of new work forms or whatever, everything I described in such utopia should work. It works when it's a climate activist bubble of students who can for some years, I don't know, go to the woods and live there and maybe rely on their parents' money or whatever. But when we look about, when we think about radical change for everyone and we analyze it in a materialist way, then it's quite, the situations are always very different. So also the contradictions are always, and very different.
Thank you, first of all, for the talks. The perspectives were really, really fascinating and intriguing. And while you were talking about how hard it is to imagine the current existence of utopia or what is happening right now, it's hard to imagine. Just the thought of imagination came to my head, and how easy it is to rally people around the idea of imagining a community or people. So like when you mobilize people in a nationalist movement, or you mobilize people in a territorial movement, how, like for example, Anderson's imagined community, or to rally people around the idea of a nation, and like people would kill each other for the idea of a territory or a nation, but how hard it is to get people to imagine about, let's say, environment or ideas of rallying around the, like I feel like when we are talking about imagination of a better future in terms of the environment, it always seems like an obligatory thing that we now have to do. You know, we can't relate to it as a, oh, I would kill for my nation. I'm not saying kill for your nation. I'm just saying, like you can't rally around the, like, I don't think people are that attached to the idea and of like rallying around nation and like intrinsically motivated towards as they are towards, let's say, a nationalist project or a project about territory, which is also filled by people. So I was wondering, is this because of the, like, let's say, the divide from enlightenment between the human and nature divide, or like how we were made to think differently about separate nature from our existence or human existence, or like human subjects? How would they imagine a life that is, like, how would you attach yourself to the idea of nature as intrinsically and aggressively as you do to a people? So like also like the idea of imperilment, that your nation or your territory is in peril, is so much scarier to people than saying, oh, your world is in peril, the world you're living in might end. So just like that, this thought about how you get people to imagine so aggressively about, not saying aggressively in a bad way, but aggressively about the environment without it being an obligation. So just a thought. I don't even know if there's a concrete answer to it.
Thanks also, Julia, for the answer with the family relations. And then I want to ask a follow-up question on this, maybe then also directed to the wider audience. Maybe, for example, also if we ask about how workers want to work and live, I'm just curious whether also questions came up in the following way, like, you know, what work means. We all know these feminist critiques as well, that work is more than only the paid work, right? Also the care work, unpaid work, reciprocity, gifting. I'm just curious how it looks like. Also because, I mean, there was one picture of this household, right? And Julia reflected also on some household dynamics. So I'm just wondering how the household, also in the painting, how it looked like. It looked actually more than this small core family or nucleus family. So I'm just curious whether you could also elaborate whether these kind of interdependent relations in a wider household were reflected upon in these workshops.
So I wondered whether you could, it came up with Jacob's talk because you were the only one focusing on fossil subjects. Yeah, the panel is on the ecological question, which could mean a lot of different ecological problems. So I wondered what's at stake in making this into a fossil subject question. And this also comes up for the others, because I think when you go, a question about the fossil subject, so making it about fossil fuels and decarbonization rather than ecological problems in relation to nature.
Yeah, labor and nature, that is my subject. I was definitely not talking only about fossil fuels, that's why I brought this examples of mining and so on and so forth. And I did research with workers in Brazil, in South Africa, in India, and in Spain, UK, and Sweden. Why am I saying it? Because the labor-nature relationship in those countries is very different. And what I found out so far, which is very simplistic, is that when people are working within the processes of nature, like, for instance, small fisher, not the industrialized fisher, but the small fishers or the small agricultural people, they are more likely, of course, to understand their relation, their life to the working, to nature processes. The problem is that, for instance, the steel workers are also dealing with nature, because steel comes from nature like everything else. But since this is privatized nature that they experience as part of capital, for most people working in industrialized production, what we call this nature is the other. So it's like this pristine nature where you go out into the woods in order to recreate or something. There is no relationship in experience and emotions between the kind of work they are doing and the fact that this is part of transforming nature, that they are working with transformed nature and transforming it further. So one idea about how to develop that would be that workers on the, wie heißt es nochmal, on the supply chain, yeah, would connect to each other. Because, steel workers going into a mine where the ore is mined, they will get another idea about what they're doing. So I think experience would be an important thing. To kind of transform the way in which you think about how you live in nature. So experience, because you're dependent from all these workers along the supply chain objectively, but you don't know them, never see them. You don't know their working conditions, only in an abstract way if there is a radio feature about it or so. But that is something, for instance, that is lacking so much in trade union just transition policies, because they're all national. They're about my sector, and if they're very broad, they're about my country. How can I develop my country with the new technologies to be competitive in the world? They don't think about what happens along the supply chain if I change this workplace. So again, that is a kind of task that I think is doable because these relations exist. And how can we develop these relations? And that would also mean developing a different relationship between your living, your work, and the nature you are transforming.
On the question of what motivates people to act, the nation, the family, one's racial group or ethnicity, gender. These questions are very powerful. They're also negatively posed. They're against those who want to take it away, right? Take away my family, my nation. Whereas environmental justice is seen, or the climate especially, it's an abstract concept in a sense. Like weather is concrete. Like you could feel the weather, but you cannot feel the climate. The climate is a statistical abstraction about weather over time, and climate justice itself, it's kind of an abstract. It's mediated. You don't experience climate directly. It's always mediated through weather events or through changing sea level rises or other things. So how do you motivate people to act on something abstract? I mean, that's the dilemma. Maybe it's the wrong question if it seems like it's wrong, if there's no answer. I think that these struggles will be always mediated through other struggles, right? So, which means reimagining class struggles as ecological, right? In the way you mentioned, right? So, steel workers are also, doing ecology, in a sense, right? They're part of the ecological chain, and how can you? And you can even see it in kinds of struggles that wouldn't call themselves ecological, right? But they can be seen as effects of this green transition or effects of changing weather patterns. But they're not. I mean, but people care about their material interests in their daily lives. That's more motivating than any kind of abstraction that gets sold to them. So I think the question is not how do you bring this abstraction and say act on this. Is how do you see these these struggles as already ecological, and then from there expand the imagination towards new possibilities. I was just kind of thinking about what motivated people to be called socialists, like in the early 20th century, in the Social Democratic Party. The vision of socialism was very empty, actually, right? It wasn't that strong. It was like, okay, we're going to have some kind of society with things in common, but barely any plan before 1918. But tons of members of these parties, millions. I mean, they had concrete enemies, right? They had concrete experience, and they had a kind of moral community with institutions that gave them space to discuss and share and talk to each other and fight. And the vision of socialism was kind of just a placeholder for something not this, something better, which is also a problem sometimes, right? Because then when the chance came, the vision wasn't so concrete yet. But somehow this idea, this vision was tied to just the daily life. I think if that doesn't happen with climate change, right, then it'll never be acted upon.
The field of study, which Nora also was mentioning, and in the last years there comes more and more research on that topic, which is the labor process theory, which says, okay, probably a building worker will be in another way of contact to nature than a bus driver, for example. And there are beautiful explanations how, for example, bus drivers, of course, do see, okay, when it's more than 30 degrees, I drive completely differently through a city than when it's cold, or building workers who say, okay, I do, when I go to the streets and I see the bird next to me, I have kind of a connection to it during work, whether when it's, again, I don't know, very hot or whatever, that way of relationship to nature changes. So I think it's very interesting to not, also in that case, not only talk about the humans per se, but to the way of work or also other ways of living, and how we get in touch with nature. And yeah, I can only agree with Nora that this way of interconnected trade unions, for example, I think that barely exists, and it seems very difficult to build it up. So even in that situation when, for example, as I mentioned, all those GKN plans, or could be any other branch, is not, like, all those struggles arise. There was not the IG Metall nor the FIOM in Italy really interested in connecting those workers. So it seems like a very, very difficult path. But I think it's a quite good idea to do it through the workers themselves, because I think there it would be quite also a new practice. I mean, Amazon workers, for example, they are gathering, but there are not so many other experiences. But I think that would be a very great idea to understand a bit more about world and world climate and world politics.
I think the nation-state question, to me, was really a great question, because you can then think, I mean, the nation is super abstract. It seems normal now, but how crazy is this? I have no relationship with someone in Kiel. I've never been there. So I think it actually can make you hopeful that there is a way to construct an imagined community around the planet. Plus, I want to end with a quote by Vladimir Vernadsky, who in the beginning of the 20th century thought, like, where, you know, maybe you could argue nation states were not as normal, maybe. And he found it really very normal to say, well, you know, people have relations to their church, to their family, to their community. They also have now relationships to their planet. This will just happen. And this was it was not even something, now it would be like, we have to develop this and put all this work into it. For him, it was just a thing that he stated as, that is to be expected. It will happen. So yes, I'm going to end on this note. Thank you so much for your papers and the discussion.